Welcome everybody. This is Joanna Walker, the Head of Private Clients at CAF. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second broadcast in the CAF's Philanthropy Summer Series of webinars. Thank you for joining us today. As some of you may know, we started the series in response to our donors, our clients, advisors who we worked with, people who we speak to on a daily basis, who wanted to learn more about the issues that they care most about. And we thought that CAF would be uniquely positioned as a convener to do that. Our 90 years of experience as a charity, a bank and a champion for better giving means we can really bring together some experts in certain fields of the issues that people want to talk about, people are seeing in the news and the media. And so we're absolutely thrilled to have three very knowledgeable, experienced people here to us today. Our hope is by the end of each broadcast, and this one included, that we'll all have learned a little bit more about the challenges that are being faced, the causes, their impact, some of the potential solutions, and the ways that we can practically help to solve them and to have a real impact and improve things. So I'm absolutely privileged today to introduce this broadcast on the refugee crisis, from emergency response to long-term resettlement. What solutions really work? Across Europe this summer we are seeing yet again people who are travelling in extremely perilous circumstances by boat, by road, by train, by car, by foot, whatever means they can to improve their lives, to move from a situation of extreme insecurity and danger, which our speakers will talk more about today, to hopefully a better lives for themselves and their family, and ultimately to go home, which I think is the wish of most refugees, as our speakers will tell us about today. And separated families and the various issues we've seen. So we thought this was a really good time to be talking about the refugee crisis and to bring people together to share their experience and their expertise. So I have three speakers with us today. We have Laura Paduan, who is the External Relations Officer for UNHCR. Welcome, Laura.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. And Nico Stevens, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Help Refugees.
Hello.
Hi, Nico. And Lyndall Stein, who is on the board of the Refugee Council and is currently the Interim Director of WWF.
Thank you. Hi.
Welcome to you all. So first of all, we are going to be talking to Laura from the UNHCR. And before we do that, we will be asking you all a question. Laura is going to talk to us about the global overview. So the first question to you in the audience, as you know, for those who've joined us before, this is interactive. We want you to engage throughout the broadcast. We'll be asking various questions and polls of you, and also please do send us your questions using the chat function on the webinar facilities. We'd love to answer those at the end of the broadcast. We'll be going till 1 o'clock today, so please do send in your questions. We've got plenty of time to answer them. So the first question we have for the audience today: most refugees will end up resettled, that's ultimately resettled, in a European nation or the United States. True or false? Please select your answer now. Okay, and we have the results of the poll. 57% of people believe that that is true. So Laura, how expert are our audience? Is that correct?
Well, actually, it is correct. So your audience are quite expert. I think it's important to note that resettlement is a distinct term, and it's when we help refugees who are already in their first country of asylum to resettle to a second country. So we offer resettlement where really there is no durable solution for those people who are in a very vulnerable situation. So the UK runs the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme for Syrian refugees. UNHCR identifies the most vulnerable people, and they're usually in camps in Jordan or really precarious situations in Lebanon or Iraq or Egypt. So sometimes that can be female-headed households where the father of a family has been killed. It can be refugees with disabilities. It can be certain minority groups who are particularly persecuted in the country that they find themselves in, or people with specific illnesses where they can't receive treatment where they are. So UNHCR identifies those refugees and then We then pass over the cases to countries like the US, Canada, the UK, other countries in Europe, who then do their own security checks. So it's a very safe and secure way to identify the people who are really most in need. They can't go back to their home countries, but it's very difficult for them to find citizenship or a secure way of living in the country that they found themselves in. So yes, it is correct that the majority of refugees are resettled to those countries, but it's a very different question to the one of where most refugees find asylum.
Understood. So Laura, please do tell us a little bit more. Laura is extremely experienced in the field of refugees and international development. She's been the UNHCR spokeswoman for the past 10 years, based in London, but has worked all over the world in Greece, Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Jordan, the Middle East, Calais, and even Central America, which we were talking about just before we came on air, actually. So Laura's going to talk to us a little bit about the global overview of the refugee crisis in its entirety and the mass movements we're seeing. Please, over to you.
Yeah, I thought I'd start off by showing this picture of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency's precursor organisation, which was called the International Refugee Organisation, which was set up after the Second World War to deal with the problem of refugees from Europe. So these are European refugees who fled the Nazis, and Europe had a problem of around 3 million people who were displaced, and the world's nations got together at the UN and said, well, never again. What can we do to make sure that people fleeing war and persecution, like the people fleeing the Nazis, find protection? So in 1950, the UN Convention, 1951 UN Convention on Refugees was drafted and signed by a number of member states, and the UN Refugee Agency was formed to become the guardian of the 1951 Convention. So the definition of a refugee, according to the Convention, is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution. And I think it is really important to make that argument for refugees as people who are in need of safety as distinct from economic migrants. And there are a lot of really good arguments around the economic migration debate. But for organisations like UNHCR and Help Refugees, it's very important that we make a specific case of why refugees are people who are particularly in need of help. And that is because if they're returned to their country of origin, then they do face persecution or risk of death. So these are people who are in need of sanctuary, and UNHCR through the 1951 Convention holds governments to account to provide that sanctuary through asylum. So it happened in Europe in the Second World War, and it's now we originally had a 3-year mandate to wrap up the refugee problem, but unfortunately we are still in business and we are still caring for the 68 million people who are displaced throughout the world. So if we look at the next slide, in June last month, we released our global trends for 2017. So that's all of the statistics around forced displacement. And we can see that the top nationalities of people fleeing are from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Somalia, Sudan, DR Congo, Central African Republic. All of these countries have been in the top 10 for quite some time. The newest country to enter that unfortunate list is Myanmar, because in August last year is when we saw the violence that flared up in Myanmar and the Rohingya people fleeing to Bangladesh. So that's why that nationality is well represented. But those are the main nationalities of refugees in the world in 2017. And those statistics are comprised of 25.4 million refugees, around 20 million under our mandate, and just over 1 million are Palestinian refugees. There is a specific UN organisation called the UN Relief and Works Agency that has a mandate to care for Palestinian refugees. And then 40 million people who are internally displaced. So they are probably in need of humanitarian assistance. They don't have the protection of their governments, but they haven't yet crossed a border. So to be a refugee, you will have crossed a border. And then 3.1 million asylum seekers, so people who are in the act of claiming asylum but have not yet been recognised as refugees by another government. So this chart shows the major countries of origin for new refugees last year. So you can see that there are over 1 million people from South Sudan, the world's newest country. Sadly, a few years ago, I remember celebrating at the South Sudanese embassy when this country finally gained independence from Sudan, but then very quickly descended into its own civil war, and there's terrible brutality and bombing and ongoing conflict within the country, and that's meant that over 2 million people have now fled, mainly to Ethiopia and Uganda. So you can see, and Sudan as well. So you can see the countries on the left, Sudan, Syria, Myanmar, are where the majority of new refugees in 2017 left. And the countries on the right are the places that they fled to. So you can see the top places were Turkey, Bangladesh, Sudan, Uganda, and then further down the list is Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Angola, Tanzania. So what I'm trying to highlight with this chart is the fact that the majority of refugees are hosted by some of the world's poorest countries. It's over 80% of refugees find asylum in countries neighbouring their own. And that is largely because, as you mentioned, most refugees do want to stay near to their home, and their hope is that when conditions are safe for them to do so, they can return to their villages and where they've come from. Unfortunately, quite often that's not the case. But I just want to show that contrary to the statistics around resettlement that we discussed, the majority of refugees are still being hosted in some of the world's poorest countries, and it's often the world's poorest people who are opening their homes, giving their land, sharing their resources with refugees. So the next picture I took on the border with, on the right-hand side, Hungary and northern Serbia in 2015. And the picture on the left is of Hungarian refugees in 1956. In 1956, the UK agreed to resettle 20,000 Hungarian refugees. We did it, as you can see, in a humane, dignified manner. We recognised that people on our doorstep were in need of protection, and we offered them a safe legal route to the UK. 3 years ago, this was the situation in Europe. Children, women, elderly people, they met barbed wire, pepper gas, and often police brutality on the doorstep of Europe as people travelled from Greece through to Macedonia, northern Serbia, and then trying to get back into the EU at the Hungarian border. I think that Europe can do better. We did it much better 60 years ago. There are safer ways that we can respond in a coordinated manner so that people who are in need, and the majority of these people at the Hungarian border were from Syria and Iraq, people in fleeing conflict, in need of safety. We can do this better as a huge block of nations. We should have a responsibility to treat people with dignity. So the next couple of slides, you can see that there was a sort of tide that turned, if you forgive that unfortunate phrase, when on the 1st of September 2015, the world saw this image, which was of a 3-year-old Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, who was found on the beach in Turkey. And as tragic as that image is, he's just one of the children who lost their lives at sea that year, and children continue to lose their lives at sea trying to make the very, very dangerous journey because of this lack of safe routes to other countries in Europe. This year alone, more than 1,000 people have lost their lives. Just last week, we saw the horrific images of a Libyan woman and her 5-year-old child who had drowned because they, not Libyan, they were African, but they had refused to be returned to a detention centre in Libya. The idea that facing this horrific journey across the Mediterranean is preferable to what people are leaving behind, either fleeing persecution or conflict or in detention centres in North Africa, is what's driving people to make these onward journeys. So I think we can globally do better. Countries did come together in the end of 2016 to decide a better deal for refugees, which was the Global Compact for Refugees, which is now returning to the UN General Assembly in September this year. It relies on a whole of society response that involves development actors, civil society, individuals and business to do things better. So, for example, the government in Uganda is providing refugees with a plot of land so that they can grow their own crops, feed their own families, and no longer become dependent on a sticking plaster of humanitarian response. But we're working with governments around the world to make sure that refugees are empowered, they have access to livelihoods, and they can support their own families. So we can discuss that a bit later. And also, I just want to end on this image, which is from one of the refugees' welcome marches in London, to say that individuals can make a difference. Civil society did respond in a really positive way. We've seen such an outpouring, not just of donations, but of compassion, people wanting to help, and people taking to the streets and engaging in political action does really make a difference, because as a result of these marches and as a result of campaigning on the likes of UNHCR, Help Refugees, and a lot of other organisations in the sector, we did manage to get the government to commit to resettling 20,000 Syrian refugees to the UK by 2020. So, all of this does really make a difference and does make lives better for refugees.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Laura, for ending on such a positive note there. And that was a fascinating history of the UNHCR, which actually I hadn't really fully appreciated. And to compare the response back then to the response now is really interesting to see, particularly with the Hungarian example. Extraordinary. And the sheer scale and numbers of the refugees that we're seeing now and that you produced in your Global Trends report just last month is really quite staggering. And one of the things we've seen a lot in the media is the US response to families, parents with young children arriving at the sort of southern US border. And we've heard a lot about their response, but not necessarily about the reasons why people are arriving in such huge volumes at the border. What is it that's causing such a huge migration of people?
Absolutely. It's an issue that has become entangled with the migration debate, but many of the people who are arriving at the US border are fleeing violence and persecution from Central America. So a lot of the people aren't economic migrants from Mexico, but they're coming from some of the world's most dangerous countries. So Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras have the highest murder rate of any country in the world. And that's because gang violence has really taken over those countries. It's very, very dangerous. There is very little state protection for people who don't want to become caught up in this violence. Young boys and girls are being recruited into gangs as sort of foot soldiers, as drug mules. The girls, very young teenagers are being recruited as gang girlfriends. And if they refuse to take part, or if the family says sometimes they even try to move to a different area of the town, then they're hunted out by the gangs and killed. Some of the families that I'd met, they'd had, all of the male members of their family had been shot by the gangs because they didn't want to to take sides. That's not the kind of life that they wanted. So they were left with very, very little choice but to make that very dangerous onward journey through Mexico, where again, often the gangs do follow them and hunt them down, and then to try to seek asylum once they get to the border with the United States. So that's, one of the reasons that we have been trying to draw attention to for a long time, why there is this crisis in Central America, and that people do need state protection in countries like the US.
Because of the complete breakdown of civil society.
Absolutely.
Extraordinary. Thank you so much, Laura. We'll come back to you for questions a little bit later on. And before we move to our next speaker, we have another question for you in the audience. So our second question to you is, put in the situation, what would you do to support refugees during a refugee crisis? Would you donate clothes, toys, or other household goods? Would you donate money? We had a whole webinar about direct cash giving last month, which is fascinating. So maybe some of you have a different view on that now. Would you volunteer to work in a refugee camp? Would you lobby government or other agencies, or would you do all of the above? Which is an extraordinary capacity to do all of those things.
I would say that there are probably a few wonderful angels who are in the position of doing all of the above. But I think that we have to recognise that people have a lot of competing priorities, and there are some wonderful causes out there, but and people can respond in different ways. If you're able to give money, then that's a wonderful thing, because it enables organisations who do have the capacity to respond in countries around the world to keep doing that, to providing UNHCR, for example, provides the shelter, the blankets, the cooking sets, the sleeping mats to people in refugee camps. But we also register them and help make sure that they are protected in those countries. And we also resettle to other countries. But if you don't have money to give, then you can lobby governments. There are political actions that you can take. We have an online petition that we're doing together with Amnesty International, which is asking the government to provide greater family reunion rights to refugees, for example. However, if you do want to provide toys and clothes, there are other organisations. I would say that it's better to give locally, because there are plenty of asylum seekers and refugees in the UK who are in need of, very basic things like toys or books or prams, and we have seen a really positive response from local communities giving these things, and I know that they are really appreciated and welcomed by the refugees. But I would say try to do that on a local level rather than sending them abroad.
That makes sense. Thank you. And our audience have answered the call, and 20% would donate clothes, toys, or other household goods. 50% would donate money, and 10% would volunteer or lobby government or do all of the above, which is quite extraordinary. Now, moving to our next speaker, Nico Stevens, who did precisely that in 2015. Nico was one of the very first people to respond to the Twitter hashtag #HelpCalais, and with a group of friends set about raising £1,000 to hire a van and take some things to the refugees in the Calais jungle camp, as it was described. And by the end of the worst week, had done rather better than that. So, Nico, perhaps you could tell us the story of Help Refugees, how it started, and how you operate in refugee situations.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So, as you said, in 2015 in the summer, Laura showed us the photos of Alan Kurdi on the beach, and the European crisis in Europe was really starting to begin. And what we found in the UK was a real uprising and movement of civil society, of ordinary people who really, really wanted to help, but didn't necessarily have the platform to be able to do so. So just before that image came out, we started a hashtag called Help Calais. And we're expecting just to raise, as you said, £1,000, a very small van, a load of donations, and ended up raising £56,000 in a week, and having 15 rooms in our big yellow storage unit in North Finchley, and 7,000 packages of aid arrive every single day. So at that point we thought, okay, we have to go to Calais and work out who we're going to give all of this aid to. And what we found when we got there was just absolutely staggering. There was a field of 5,000 people living there with absolutely nothing to survive on. There were no tents. There was babies without shoes, children living by themselves, unaccompanied minors, and we were expecting to hand all of this aid over to an NGO or a governmental body, but instead what we found was a few local French associations doing their very, very best to deal with both the refugees that were living there, but also the influx of British aid and volunteers, but really struggling. So at that point, we decided we couldn't leave. We partnered with a French association called L'Auberge de Migrants, We started a warehouse, a volunteer program, distribution networks within the camps, a hot food kitchen, cold food packages that were adapted to each of the cultures. There were many different cultures living there. So we essentially became the umbrella for all of the different civil society actors who were there. As I said, there were a huge number of people who really, really wanted to help. So we remained in that role as essentially camp management in the absence of one until the camp was demolished in October 2016, and we're still there providing the similar services to the about 2,000 people who are living in the northern France area. Meanwhile, back in London, we continue to be quite good at crowdfunding. We were able to get stories from the ground, tell people stories, amplify voices, and provide a really trustworthy way for people to donate their time and their energy and volunteering. So we continue to replicate that model of supporting civil society groups on the ground. We started working on the Greek islands in October 2015, putting credit into supermarkets so that local people were able to cook food. We were supporting search and rescue efforts. And since then, we've just moved as the crisis has developed. So we work across the migratory route in 10 countries in the Middle East and Europe. We've supported, in 2 years, we supported 722,000 people. And we work really hard to make sure that we support local grassroots efforts in everything that we do.
That's extraordinary. And so you've been able to take the lessons you've learned in Calais and take those to different settlements and different areas around the world. Is that right?
Yeah. So what we found is that I think in most emergency settings, the local and civil society groups are the ones who are responding first, and quite often they're the first responders. And then as NGOs and different actors come in, we have to adapt with the ecosystem and make sure that everything is coordinated and supported. So we support people who are on the ground in various different ways through funding, donations in kind, logistics, volunteers, and try to really make sure that civil society is engaged and public opinion is heard.
Great. And how do you work with other organisations? You mentioned that you sort of took on this camp manager umbrella role when you first arrived in Calais. How do you tend to work with other organisations now to make sure that people aren't running around doing the same thing, but actually there is a place for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. I think coordination is absolutely key. It's so vital in every single setting, especially as things move from emergency to early onset and then through the different phases. So we coordinate with all of the different grassroots organisations. We have a really networked-based approach. That's how we understand what is happening on the ground and who we should support and who is being most effective. And then we make sure that we coordinate all the way up to the high level. So taking Greece as an example, we coordinate mechanisms within the informal sector, which is more the grassroots organisations, and run bi-weekly coordination meetings, and then also attend the formal coordination meetings with UNHCR and with Ministry of Migration. And that means that we're able to make sure that the grassroots sector is, operating in line with standard operating procedures and that there isn't duplication. So we find coordination just ultimately so important.
Mm-hmm. And could you tell us one of the stories, as somebody sort of on the ground, tell us the stories of just one of the families that Help Refugees has helped during the time that you've been working there?
It's hard. I never want to actually be the voice of someone. So I think it's really important for all of us. UNHCR is so good at it as well, to really be able to amplify people's own voices. But we're working across Europe and the Middle East, and we're meeting families who are just so incredibly vulnerable, and they're fleeing war and persecution from all across the world, and just desperately trying to seek sanctuary wherever they end up. And unfortunately, there seem to be a lot of barriers to that. So in Calais, we meet a lot of unaccompanied minors. These are children who are by themselves as young as 7. They're incredibly vulnerable, totally by themselves. And with other organisations like UNHCR, we've been able to open and advocate for legal and safe routes to the UK. So we're meeting people who are really really incredibly vulnerable and just trying to seek a better life.
Great. It's great that you're able to do something to help. Wonderful. Thank you. We'll come back to you later, Nico, for some more questions. Now, before moving on to our third speaker, Lyndall, we have another question for you, the audience. Simple question. The majority of refugees are young men. True or false? Please submit your answers now. And the answer is most of our audience believe it is false. The majority are not young men. And the answer is that's true, isn't it? It's mainly women, 50% are women, and more than 50% are women and children. So, which isn't necessarily always what we see on the news and the media. I think we see images of young men, and that sort of confuses the reality. That moves us to our third and final speaker today, Lyndall Stein. Lyndall, welcome. Lyndall is extremely experienced, having worked in refugee and international development work from her native South Africa all the way through to working for organisations like Bond, Practical Action, VSO, has been a huge campaigner and has most recently returned from visiting Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya crisis has really taken place, along with Shahid Al-Alam of Drek, who is a social entrepreneur, and Lyndall and he worked together to produce a photo story of the situation and the experiences of people on the ground there. Lyndall, tell us about your most recent experiences and what it is that you saw.
Well, I think just to give a bit of a sense of why I was really eager to go when Shahid asked me to go and help him. He said, I've no money and I'm not being paid, but I've got a few air miles. And I had just finished a contract and had a little bit of time, but I'm South African, and last week was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, and I was brought up with refugees from South Africa, and refugees from Nazi Germany were always at our table. And if you think about the role that the UK played in hosting South African refugees, I'm not sure that the fight against apartheid would have been successful, because one of the leader of the ANC in all the years that Nelson Mandela was in prison was he and his family and many other South Africans were refugees here in London. Most of them actually in Muswell Hill. I don't know quite why, but
oh goodness.
So I think it's so important to realise how honourable our history is and how much has changed and how much we need to reclaim our place as somewhere that offers refuge. I think also, just to speak to the point about refugees wanting to go home, most of the refugees who are here, even the people as old as I am, and I'm pretty old, went back when apartheid was defeated, and I think practically every Namibian who was here went back when they won the struggle for independence. So I went really as a individual, as a volunteer, in a sense as a witness to see the terrible crisis that was unfolding. And it was really quite extraordinary. I'd been to visit similar situations, but as part of an organisation, and it was very different to go as an individual, though I had a marvellous expert guide in Shahid, who is deeply committed to the cause of justice and deeply concerned about the situation in his country and seeing what had happened to the Rohingya people. And it's one of the fastest movements of refugees ever in history. 500,000 people who in a few weeks moved across from the Myanmar border and set up camp themselves. I mean, at the stage that I went, it was just a few weeks after that massive movement of people. And it was really terrible to see the situation because nobody had got a chance to actually get there yet. There were organisations just in the very beginning of their job. And I think really impressive was to see the role of Bangladeshi organisations. And I think that's another real inspiration, is to see how local civil society, local organisations, the hospital, how they worked. There's an image of this young girl who was 14 and who was traumatized by the terrible experience. I mean, everyone I spoke to talked about the murder of children, the rape of women, without exception. I heard that from everyone I spoke to. And the young girl that I met was being treated by a local organisation for she had basically lost her mind, was, really in a terrible state. And this young girl that you see looking after her father, who I fear was very, very ill, was in a local hospital, and the response of that local hospital was absolutely extraordinary. But I think it is the amazing tapestry of people working together. When I was there had been very little put in place, but now with the work of organisations such as UNHCR and the DEC, they've been able to reach over 300,000 people. They've been able to put in the really important necessities, washing facilities, and that, making sure that there's proper sewerage systems. I mean, when I was there, the smell was appalling, and they were so frightened of cholera taking hold, because it was it's a totally unsuitable situation to put a refugee camp. It's on hills, very, very dangerous landslides, very difficult to put proper water systems in. But that is where they are, and how to move them is a really possible problem. And I think also, in a sense, seeing the before, one of the really sad sights was children just wandering with nowhere to go and now they have got some basic schools in and places for people to meet, but there was none of that. And I think also just recognizing that such a poor country as Bangladesh was having to put so much into a situation when they have so few resources themselves. And another really interesting part of that experience was meeting two photojournalists from Myanmar were staying with my friend Shahidul, and he was kind of sheltering them because there had been some problems. And for them to tell the story of the perspective of how people in Myanmar see the Rohingya. And they were really struggling to tell the story of the Rohingya back home, but they were saying that the hatred and the cruelty and the difficulty in speaking out if you're in Myanmar, was really impossible. And that's the really, that was when you hear from both sides, you hear from people who are from Myanmar about how the Rohingyas are treated, and when you speak to people individually and hear their stories and recognize, that this challenge of how to reintegrate them, how to get them to be able to go home, and that's what they want. One woman said to me, at home I had a cow and I had my fields and I could feed myself. Nobody wants to be dependent and helpless. But how you can actually get them back safely, and how we can continue to support them, to give them the basics that they need to be healthy, for their children to have some access to education, and for them to be safe, because I think that's the common experience of refugees, that they are fleeing terror that is unimaginable for most of us. And that's where I think all of us as individuals have a role to play. And whatever that is has to be right for you, but it has to be a role that we embrace from our positions, where we don't have to wake up every day in terror, and we don't have to wake up every day and wondering whether our children will starve that day. So I believe that we can listen to people's stories. There's a wonderful project called Refugee Tales, where people just walk and listen to refugee stories, whether we support organisations operating here in the UK or international organisations, but our ability to speak up for refugees, our commitment to be able to share some of what we have with refugees is, I think, one of the most important and critical issues for us right now in our world. And I think the causes for the great movement of people moving against their will are complex, but they are intense, whether it's conflict, whether it's the impact of climate change. It's not simple, but people's need for basic safety, for the ability to feed themselves and their children, for their children to get educated, for people to have the chance to work and contribute. The Refugee Council runs a wonderful program where they train refugee doctors to be able to work in our health systems. And, that is just one illustration of the many ways in which refugees can contribute. But if we don't give people the chance to contribute, to be full human beings, then we leave them in a desolate limbo. And I think I know as someone who has Jewish heritage how important it is that people stood up for the rights of people who are demonized and persecuted and destroyed. And we all own a bit of that responsibility and have to find our own way to make our contribution as fellow humans.
Thank you, Lyndall. That's extremely moving, I think. And from what you saw of the Rohingya crisis, what was it that seemed different? Was it different from anything you'd seen before? Was there something about it that really struck you?
Well, I've never been to, I've been to many refugee camps, and I've never been to a refugee camp that was in such an unsuitable location. And, you know, the sense of imminent disaster, whether from cholera or from a landslide, and that was really different because often there is some chance to find a suitable physical location. And even the access, you couldn't kind of get anywhere. You couldn't get any vehicles in. And the chaos, I mean, I saw this child walking around, lost, crying, little 4-year-old child, and then a woman who had lost her child, and you didn't know whether they were connected. I mean, there was a great project that I think Handicapped International were doing where they were trying to actually reunite people. And of course, the Red Crescent, Red Cross also work on that. But I don't think I've ever been to somewhere that, I've been to places that are sad and bleak, but I've never been to somewhere that was so chaotic. And I think that was to do with the speed of movement, the amount of people who fled in such terror over such a short amount of time, and the actual physical location, which was totally unsuitable, but was where people ended up.
And how are you feeling now about it? Do you feel pessimistic about the situation, what the refugees crisis that we're seeing globally, or optimistic, or how are you feeling about how the world is reacting? And you mentioned before we all have a part to play in this.
Well, I believe that we can't afford to be pessimistic. I mean, for me, what is really inspiring in this country is how the British people responded to that photo. I mean, I know there was a woman who was just an ordinary person, and she put something on Facebook saying, we need to have a march in support of refugees. And I remember seeing the kind of communication, which was really scrappy, and wondering, who did this? But yes, there should be a march for refugees. And I went off to this march for refugees, which had lots of families and people there, very, very positive feeling. And she spoke. And she said, I'm just an ordinary person. And I put this on Facebook, and I thought I'd have just few dozen people who I knew. And 90,000 people responded. And she had to then go and ask big organizations to help her. So I believe that people will respond with you know, the best of human intentions. And that's not just in this country, but how the people in Greece have helped the refugees who've arrived there. And there's lots of other examples. So we can't afford to be pessimistic. We have to work together to find solutions, to tell the stories, to communicate the right information, and to make sure that politicians do what should be done to support people in the most desperate situations.
I think that's right. There is a place for everybody, and what strikes me about refugee crisis and the different kinds of situations that people find themselves in, whether it's fleeing in a dangerous emergency, or whether it's looking for long-term resettlement because it's a political situation they're fleeing from, and the different agencies that are involved. Laura, you were telling us a little bit earlier on about how there is a cluster system which makes sure that resources are not wasted and everybody has their part to play. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, and I'd like to ask the audience to continue to send in your questions. We have some time for questions and answers now, so do please send them in and we'll try to get them as quickly as we can. Laura?
Yeah, that's right. I think there are a lot of international actors with a lot of experience dealing with humanitarian crises around the world. And as Nico said, you know, one of the most important factors in responding is coordination, and that's because we need to make the very best use of resources that we have, and to distribute aid in the most effective manner so that the people most in need get that aid. So we've got a lot of experience working with Oxfam and Save the Children and UNICEF, and each organisation takes a lead in different clusters. So in a refugee situation, it is UNHCR who is the lead agency coordinating a response, but we are responsible for shelter. And that can mean really different things. So, for example, in Bangladesh, as Lyndall said, it's one of the geographical locations which is least suitable to host refugees because of the topography of the landscape. It's incredibly hilly. In a few months ago, the monsoon rains came. So we were working around the clock to level off the hills so that when the rain came, the shelters that were at the bottom of the hills weren't then completely flattened by the mud from the landslide. So, that's one of the things that UNHCR does that you might perhaps not think, but, we're always working with experts to think of how best to protect people from the elements, and certainly the Rohingya in Bangladesh are very, very vulnerable where they are currently. But then other organisations will take a response in other areas. So it's Oxfam on water and sanitation, UNICEF, of course, take the lead with children and providing safe places for children so that they can still have some kind of semblance of a childhood, because when you are ripped out of your home country, then it is really important for children to have the stability to still go to school. And unfortunately with refugees, we do know that this is a population that can really risk becoming a lost generation for in a lot of different nationalities and situations. So it's only 23% of refugee children who do have the ability to get secondary education. So when people don't have the skills and qualifications to be able to go back to their home countries to rebuild, then that's, it's dangerous for the future of that country. So providing education is really important, not just for the stability and mental health of those children, but also thinking of the future and rebuilding the country.
And the longer term as well. And Lyndall, you wanted to say something on the clusters?
Well, I think also just to say that I know the situation has improved a great deal, even though it's very difficult still in terms of the Rohingya crisis. I mean, the basics such as really good washing systems there, which is one of the projects that was funded by the DEC. And I think we should also be proud in this country that the Disasters Emergency Committee, which is a lot of the charities who then worked together and put out appeals to the British public, and the British public have been incredibly generous and given millions and millions of pounds. It's not enough, but it's great that that happens, and that then makes sure that there's a clear one voice speaking out to the British public about supporting the kind of crisis that we're talking about in terms of the Rohingya. So I'm really cheered to see this photo of a washing station, because these basic resources are what will make the difference between people being healthy or falling victim to terrible epidemics, which is all our responsibilities to make sure don't happen.
Yes, that's an additional consequence of the vulnerable position they find themselves in. Precisely, that's a wonderful picture. And CAF, many of our donors support the DEC appeals very actively, which is wonderful to see. So we have a further question for the audience, our last question for you today, before we go to the Q&A section. So whether or not you've donated to a refugee crisis in the past, would you consider it now? Do please answer. Okay, wonderful. And we'll just be moving to some further questions now. Nico, what I wanted to ask you, Help Refugees is a wonderful sort of grassroots organisation that was born out of passion, energy, and a can-do attitude, and was very clear about what you wanted to do at the start when you first went across to Calais, and had to adjust when you got there, which I think is, that flexibility is so key in these kind of situations. 3 years down the line, as an organisation that has grown to be working in so many more countries, how do you find it sort of staying true to those grassroots roots and people power that you first started with? Is it a challenge? Do you find yourself sort of becoming part of the establishment, or are you still able to maintain that ethos?
It's a really good question, actually, and it's one that we're, as an organisation, constantly reflecting on. And and discussing. I think in terms of an organisational remit, what we intend to do is fill gaps, and we don't want to exist. I think, any charity should never want to exist, but whilst there are still gaps in the areas that we're working in, we feel like there's a need for us to be there. And I think we've become quite an essential part of the ecosystem of the response in the areas that we're working in as well. But we still do, we still do hold on to our real grassroots values, and we're making sure that it's very volunteer-led. We have a very field-based approach with a network-based approach. We're independent, so we can speak out. We're not held by state, obligations. But yes, it's something that we're always reflecting on. But I think the civil society actions that we kind of lead on and have in the UK really make sure that we stay true to our roots.
That's wonderful. It's good to keep it strong. Laura, one of the questions that we've had from our audience is, considering the crisis is so huge globally at the moment, why is it you think we're not necessarily seeing this in the media? You talked to us earlier about the situation in El Salvador. Why is it that it's this enormous crisis in 2018 and yet it doesn't seem to be top of mind, the sort of scale that perhaps it should be?
I think we're dealing with a certain level of fatigue. It's very difficult for journalists to find new angles on a story that they feel that they've already covered. There are only so many different refugee stories that they can tell that's of interest to their editors. And for somewhere like Syria, where the war's been raging for more than 7 years, but there's still no real sense of a negotiated outcome on the horizon, it's quite difficult to keep telling that story. And often for the print press, there's just room for one foreign news story, and quite often, the smaller conflicts don't ever get reported. So UNHCR is working throughout the world, but in places like Burundi, where tens of thousands of people have been forced to cross the border into Rwanda just this year because of the violence there, in the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Throughout Africa and elsewhere, there are these conflicts where people are losing their lives and people are suffering, but get very little reporting, often because it's difficult for journalists to get there, but also because I think it's not also at the top of the political agenda, and that's because our politicians are focused elsewhere, and Brexit is taking up a lot of political space and discussions, and there's very little room for other kind of foreign political debate. And I think it's important as individual citizens for us to, and as well as working for organisations, but as individuals to keep telling our politicians that actually this is important to us, and that it should remain at the top of the political agenda.
So one of the things that people can do is to continue to keep that pressure up, that it's important to them and they want some action to be seen. Is that?
Absolutely. And so taking part in marches, signing petitions, supporting the Families Together Refugee Family Reunion campaign. These are all things that people can do to show that actually we do want Britain to be a place that welcomes refugees, and that this, as Lyndall said, I think is one of the biggest challenges that we face currently, and it is testing our values to maintain that level of welcome and support and sanctuary for people in need, because elsewhere in Europe we are seeing a very different response, and we are seeing the rise in nationalist parties in government in places like Italy that are leading a debate with very xenophobic language that is having a direct impact, and it means that boats crossing the Mediterranean can't disembark in ports in Italy, and we've seen in the last few weeks situations of rescue boats being adrift at sea because countries won't let them disembark. And I think it's really important that we maintain a commitment in this country to helping countries on southern Mediterranean to make sure that they're not the ones who are bearing the most responsibility, but also further upstream, if you like. So UNHCR is taking very vulnerable people out of detention centres in Libya because we've negotiated a relationship with the government that we are able to take people out, and we're evacuating them to Niger. But we understand that the government of Niger can't be solely responsible. So we're looking at other countries, and the UK is certainly one of the countries that stepped forward to offer resettlement to the people that we've evacuated from detention centres in Libya via Niger. So I think there are different ways that people can help, but it just needs to be a priority for governments across Europe.
Great. I think that's good on practical solutions of what we're sort of looking for as well. And Nico, what is the best way, the most useful thing that donors can do to help? Is it donating cash? Is it time? Is it goods? Is it campaigning? What would you say? All of them?
I think all of them, absolutely all of them. I think that the real important thing is that everybody does something that is suitable to them. If people have a lot of time, volunteering is obviously absolutely amazing. Time is so precious, and if you have an abundance of it, volunteering even to sort clothes is really, really amazing. Funds are always so important. We're seeing, I think, globally a real lack of funding for emergency response as displacements grows, and funding is obviously absolutely essential. As Laura has been saying about writing to your MPs, you know, our Parliament is still hopefully in the position where they listen to public opinion, and it's you know, we can make a change. At the moment, Help Refugees is in the Royal Courts of Justice for our appeal over our case against the Home Office, and that's over the Dubs Amendment, and the Dubs Amendment only came into place because of public opinion. So, you know, we can really make a difference through that. And, you know, even just talking to people about the refugee crisis, raising awareness, I think it's all important.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully we've done a little of that today. And Lyndall, we've had a question from our audience. As part of any of the refugee response work you've done, have you ever provided evidence for human rights violations to build a case against situations, and was that part of the work with the Rohingya?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of work going on. There's a very wide range of agencies who are involved, and that testimonies to show what has actually happened to them in Myanmar and why they've fled has been done. I think Human Rights Watch has done some amazing work. I mean, the UN agencies will have as well. And I think even down to some of the work that's been done to try and do aerial photography in Myanmar to show actually what happened. And of course, many journalists, Shahidul included, have actually interviewed people and got their stories to add to, you know, really what is an appalling situation of brutal, terrible treatment. I mean, many women have been raped, children have been, and old people have been murdered, and you know, there is homes destroyed, and there's evidence of all of that.
So it's so important to raise the awareness, isn't it, and to tell the story. So thank you to all three of our speakers today. You've done an amazing job of sharing your expertise and experience with us. And as a result, I'm delighted to say that the results of our poll of whether people would support refugees is 100% from the audience. So thank you so much. You've done a good job of building a cohort of people. Thank you to the audience for listening. We hope you've learned something along the way today. And we'll be sending out some follow-up information for you to read further. Somebody's asked where they can go to for additional information resources. And so we'll be sending out the recording to you and signposting to other places to learn more. So thank you so much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.